This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest this week is author and analyst Chris Dalby. He's in Maastricht, but we're going to be talking to him about the Tren de Aragua. Now, this is a Venezuelan criminal syndicate that is spread throughout the Americas, Central and South America, and we're going to ask all about it because he is the director at World of Crime and author of World of Crime Guides to Organized Crime. Most recently, his book on the Jalisco cartel, New Generation, is out. An incredibly well-researched and very readable book about, the Jalisco cartel in Mexico. So, Chris, welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
No, it's great. I mean, first and foremost, let's start with the very basics. How have you decided to basically write up books on organized crime all around the world? I mean, that's a huge undertaking.
It is. So obviously, at the beginning, I'm focused on Latin America, which has been my home for many years and my area of study, particularly organized crime. I used to be the managing editor of Inside Crime for 5 years, which, if you want to have a crash course in how to do criminal investigative journalism, that's really the best place to do it. Mm-hmm. And I'm incredibly grateful to the wonderful people in that organization. Okay. World of Crime and the Guides to Organized Crime came from a question that I got over and over again in different ways from policymakers, from law enforcement, from academics, which was, where do we start? Because when you tackle an organized crime group, I think everybody understands the need to understand how each organized crime group differs from everybody else, right? It's very easy to fall, as perhaps some members of Congress have recently, in the generalization of, all cartels are terrorists, all cartels operate in the same way, and that's not true at all. Mm-hmm. So the Guides to Organized Crime are short, but very condensed thematic guides to how groups came to be, because we want to humanize them. We want to tell the human stories behind the violence and the headlines, how they operate, how they make money, who leads them, and the threats to national security they represent. We started with the Jalisco cartel because it is by far the biggest security threat to Mexico and in many ways to the United States. And now Tren de Aragua, much smaller group, much less well known internationally. But if you talk to people in South America, it's the prevailing topic of conversation, whether you're in Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela. Ecuador has other problems right now. But in many countries in South America, Tren de Aragua is maybe the main security concern.
It's a fascinating group, and I think we can see the same sort of, let's say, tentacles of its let's say commencement, its beginnings. It started in or it was being controlled from a prison, the Tocorón prison in Venezuela, to begin with, and of course we can draw similarities between the Bloque Capital in Brazil. You can look at what's going on in Ecuador. You can look at in Colombia as well. I mean, how did this start? Let's get a real basic. Let's get come in at the first floor here.
So there are similarities at the ground level. Obviously, we see in numerous Latin American and Central American countries this failure to control prisons. Prisons become breeding grounds for sophisticated gangs, right? Because that's where the gang members can meet. That's where different specialities can interact. That's where new members can be recruited. That's where a level of rules and politics and governance can be established, which can then be replicated outside the prison. So you are correct. Tren de Aragua starts as a prison gang in Tocorón, which is one of the largest prisons in Venezuela. And that is similar to the PCC in Brazil, or similar to some of the prison gangs in Ecuador, or even if you look at the MS-13 and Barrio 18 in El Salvador. Although there are large differences in how these groups operate. The big difference is that there is no other state at the time that Tren de Aragua starts, so 10 to 15, within the last 10 to 15 years, there is no state in South America which is as openly criminal as Venezuela. So where you always have a little bit of to and fro in terms of corruption and collusion between politics and organized crime, in Venezuela it's overt. And so very quickly, instead of trying to shut down these groups or take them out early, it's about how do we control them. It's about how can we use them as an extension of the state to carry out things or to profit in ways that openly we're not able to. And the Chavista regime in Venezuela is very good at doing that. Both Chavez, but especially Maduro, have perfected a system of narco-favoritism, where specific gangs can be allies for a while, then enemies at another moment when it's less politically convenient. And that can be run either at the municipal level, at the state level. The governors in Venezuela are very powerful, or even at the federal level.
So if we talk about
narco
favoritism, I mean that's a term that I would love to hear more about. Does this then draw up a conflict between Tren de Aragua and then maybe what we know slightly less about, the Cartel de los Soles? Because I know that recently Ivan Gil, who is the sort of chancellor in Venezuela, was saying that the Tren de Aragua is a fictional story created by the international media, just like the Cartel de los Soles. So where do we stand?
I mean, Cartel de los Soles is a controversial term. I think it's an accurate catch-all term to describe the criminal political connections within the Venezuelan politics and military. The Cartel de los Soles is not and never was a single structure with a boss and capos. It is a collective term to refer to all of the connections between crime, politics, and military in Venezuela. So you can refute it to a certain extent, because you can say, well, it's not a cartel, it's not an organization. That was never the intention of the name Cartel de los Soles. Tren de Aragua, irrefutably a criminal gang with traditional hierarchical connections, with a leader that we identify, with a base of operations that we identify, with criminal modus operandi that we understand, and criminal economies that are very well defined. I mean, we've arrested. There have been Tren de Aragua arrested. Connections between Cartel de los Soles and Tren de Aragua I think it's a term I'd like to move away from, because it lends credence to this idea that the Venezuelan state apparatus is controlled in a very solid way. It's not. There are myriad different connections and groups and organizations within the Venezuelan state that run their own criminal operations. They're all, to a certain extent, approved by Maduro, and certainly you, as in all these things, you pay your cut up. But one of these connections could be removed, or one of these organizations could be removed, if the person in charge falls afoul of authorities without threatening the rest of the connections. So very early on, we see Tren de Aragua as, very quickly, they emerge as a very powerful group. The name Tren de Aragua seems to have been a homage to other Venezuelan gangs like Tren de Llano. So the word tren is often associated with criminal groups in Venezuela with a very strong identity to one part of the country, so Tren de Llano or Tren de Aragua. But Tren de Aragua, within a couple of years, becomes a model on how to quickly grow a criminal gang. The level of control they had in Tocorón, I don't know of many examples, if any, in Latin America where a gang had complete control of a prison. And this was not a case of bribing the guards or bribing the director to look the other way. This was a case of the Tren de Aragua controls the prison utterly. I mean, in a very sort of headquarters kind of way. Members can leave the prison with impunity to sell drugs, to commit assassinations, to whatever mission maybe, and return. The prison is a safe haven more than it is a penitentiary.
Okay, and we will move on into this spread. Of course, we can identify that the expansion of the Tren de Aragua, well, it's been facilitated by the diaspora, the Venezuelan diaspora, the millions of Venezuelans. Of course, they're not all affiliated, but the millions of Venezuelans leaving Venezuela. So, as you mentioned at the beginning, there are strong influences in Colombia, in Peru, a small one in Ecuador, but Chile, and I think some influence in Brazil as well. But what we're seeing in the news, of course, is what is happening in Peru and Chile, where they've kind of been, I think they've been declared sort of national security threat, enemy number one in those countries. Tell us a bit more about that.
So we know the old adage that criminality is the most adaptable business in the world. Tren de Aragua's identification of the Venezuelan diaspora and how it could be criminalized is perhaps the most successful criminal innovation in South America in a generation. I would say since the advent of the cocaine trade from Colombia to the US, that is the most lucrative, new, rapid expansion that we've seen into a new criminal model. I'm in no way praising them because they're monsters. I would also like to emphasize that the overwhelming majority of Venezuelans leaving the country are seeking a better life elsewhere, are moving for horrific reasons of political and economic poverty, and should be welcomed as such or should be treated with dignity. A very small percentage are criminals. The Tren de Aragua quickly identified that the Venezuela to Colombia border was where most of the Venezuelans were seeking to cross without papers or the documentation to do so, and could therefore be exploited. So they take over what are called as trochas, these illegal or these illegal crossings between Venezuela and Colombia. This is where we really see that expansion starting. And so families or individuals are extorted. They have to pay a price to cross the trochas controlled by the Tren de Aragua, and slowly that begins to expand. The Tren de Aragua begins to force people to carry contraband across the border, or sexually exploits vulnerable. This brings them into conflict with gangs like the ELN or the Rastrojos, who were also at the time active along that border for similar reasons. This sees the Tren de Aragua change from being just a very sophisticated criminal gang to being an armed gang. And this is a big evolution for the gang, right? Before, in Aragua, in the part of Venezuela where they're from, yes, they were known for murder for hire. They were known for rampant extortion, but they were not necessarily a well-armed force. That expansion to the Colombian border forces them to begin looking at arms trafficking, to begin recruiting more members, because now they're facing, groups with decades of armed experience like the ELN in Colombia. They don't go for full clashes with the ELN because that's not a fight they want to pick, and that's not a fight they would have won at the time. Instead, they move quickly, and they begin setting up these factions, these franchises in other parts of the country. So Venezuelans go to Bolivia, to Peru, and then later to Chile, which at first was very welcoming to Venezuelans. So hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans go to Chile, and Tren de Aragua goes right along with them. They then begin to set up these networks, again with not necessarily many members in each country, but they have the networks to identify and criminalize and victimize these thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Venezuelans moving across South America. Again, that maximizes the income coming in, and it maximizes you can charge them at every border. You can make them take contraband across every border, drugs across every border, based on what the country you're heading to needs or demands or wants. So Tren de Aragua becomes these criminal journeymen, and that's the first example of the Venezuelan criminal gang really expanding in that way. Now, 6-7 years after this process begins, they've laid down roots, and they've laid down roots particularly strongly in Chile and Peru. And those roots are extortion, sexual exploitation, and local drug trafficking. The Tren de Aragua is not associated with international drug trafficking like the Medellin cartel, but they do increasingly look at venta al menudo, so local drug trafficking, what we call micro trafficking. For a long time, that is still controlled from Tocorón. So we know that these factions, if they are Tren de Aragua, and often Venezuelans who are arrested are accused of being Tren de Aragua without much proof that they are, and that's another thing to talk about, are sending money back to Tocorón, enriching Niño Guerrero, the leader in Tocorón, and his cabal of lieutenants. In the last year, everything changes. In September 2023, Maduro, or the Venezuelan government, raids Tocorón prison, smashes this institution, this complete control. And I mean, Tocorón prison had a swimming pool, gyms, nightclubs, shops, a baseball field, a concert hall, a playground for kids, shops openly selling drugs al aire libre, all that gets taken out. Why? We're not exactly sure. There are many rumors or many speculations as to why. But what we do know is that the leaders of Tren de Aragua are warned ahead of time and managed to escape. So Niño Guerrero is now on the loose. We don't know where. And the Tren de Aragua's operations outside the country continue to thrive.
Why were they able to settle so readily and I would say with ease in particular Peru and Chile?
Well, Venezuela does not cooperate openly with other countries, does not share information unless it's highly pressured to. So the expansion of Tren de Aragua was something that caught Peru and Chile, perhaps a little bit less Colombia, but still off guard. They were not, I think in the early days, did not have access to information about how the Venezuelan diaspora was being criminalized until you start seeing the spike in murders in northern Chile. Until you start seeing the rapid rise in arrests in Peruvian and Chilean cities linked to extortion, murder, sexual exploitation and the name Tren de Aragua begins to appear again and again and again in arrest reports. So I think those countries learned about Tren de Aragua when they were already in the country. So the Tren de Aragua had stolen a march on authorities in those countries.
So they were already settled. They were already embedded. I find the comment, the point on this raid in September 2023, the raid on the Tocorón prison. Of course, this is coming at the same time as the sort of as everything's going on in El Salvador with Bukele. So this was in part inspired, you think?
I do. There are many. We don't know exactly why the Maduro government decides to take Tocorón. For the last several years, the Venezuelan government has been trying to reclaim prisons and insert them into a new model. And it had taken many of the more violent prisons. It had arrested many of them or taken out many of the more powerful pranes, as we call prison bosses in Venezuela. But Niño Guerrero had been left alone despite being the most famous pran in the most famous prison, heading the most famous gang. So what triggered that raid? We don't exactly know. A couple of things do give clues, though. One, the political protector of the Tren de Aragua was Tarek El Aissami, one of the most famous politicians in Venezuela, former governor of the state of Aragua, former vice president, former minister for oil. In 2023, he falls from grace. He was seen as a potential successor for Maduro. He was seen as really being his number two, or certainly very close to him. He begins to fall from grace in 2023 during a huge corruption scandal in the oil company there. Obviously, the entire government is riddled with corruption. So if somebody falls, it's because it's politically convenient for them to do so. He was arrested in April 2024 for huge corruption. That was a big moment, because the thought of seeing Tarek El Aissami behind bars was once thought unthinkable. Right? He was an untouchable. But it might have been that it might have been that Tarek El Aissami and everything under him was no longer seen in favor. Tren de Aragua began making a lot of noise in the wrong way in other countries. A lot of bodies dropping in Chile, Peru, Colombia linked to them. The Venezuelan government may have wanted to show in a sign of good faith, and I put that in huge quotation marks, that they were doing something about it. But I think also the Bukele mania of mano dura played an impact. I think you see it in Ecuador, you see it even in Costa Rica, right? The question of can we do a Bukele here? No, in most countries, perhaps in no other country in Latin America could you do the level of mano dura that Bukele has done, and I think very controversially. But Venezuela may have wanted to show they could do something similar, and wanted to show they could take out, again in quotation marks, their largest criminal threat. But Tocorón is not Tren de Aragua, and the money laundering networks and the communication networks and the criminalization of the diaspora continue actively to this day. And we don't know where Niño Guerrero is. So at least we used to know where he was. We used to know he was in Tocorón. Now he's in the wind.
This let's say jailing or holding of Tarek El Aissami is a very interesting development. As you said, unthinkable previously that he would be, held up as a corrupt individual. They're all, corruption is riddled. The whole regime is riddled with corruption, but it was unthinkable beforehand. would you think, I mean, perhaps if he was as you say, willingly protecting the Tren de Aragua or El Niño Guerrero in some way, this is now a splintering of the Maduro regime a bit?
Maduro has been far more prescient than I think a lot of people thought in bringing the Venezuelan regime under his complete control. Tarek El Aissami is not the first regime figure to be sidelined. A few years ago, we talked a lot about Diosdado Cabello as being the number two. Now, he's not in prison, but his power has certainly been curtailed. So, no, I don't think it's a splintering of the regime. I think it's Maduro cleaning house and making sure that no one who could threaten him is still in power.
So when we talk about, and you've mentioned it previously as well, the sources of financing for the Tren de Aragua, as you're saying, it's the sexual exploitation, people trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, robbery, and micro trafficking. And of course, you've looked into this into South America. I'm sure it spreads north into Central America. How far north does this go? And of course, I'm specifically saying United States. Does the Tren de Aragua have links into the US and of course beyond that into Europe?
There is no evidence of that at this time. There is speculation that given the fact that Tren de Aragua is masterful at expanding along with the diaspora, and that now thousands of Venezuelan migrants are among those at the US-Mexico border, that could be a way for the Tren de Aragua to enter the US. I don't think that is likely to happen for a number of reasons. First of all, criminal groups in Mexico are incredibly powerful and incredibly territorial, and criminalizing the diasporas of any country that is coming to their country pretty well already. I'm not sure what openness there is for Tren de Aragua to do that in Mexico, right? Without sparking a war far from home, where their false projection would be minimal. Secondly, the power of, for example, the Mexican cartels in the US is again helped by the diaspora. And again, I caveat the point of the diaspora are victims of these cartels, not willing participants in their activities. But there is a colossal Mexican diaspora in the US, both legal and illegal, which facilitates the spreading of networks. Of course, there is a Venezuelan diaspora in the United States, but nothing on like the same level, nothing like as established, and not as embedded into the fabric of organized crime in the United States as Mexican organized crime. I think that would take a long time and significant efforts for the Tren de Aragua to enter. And I'm not sure what criminal economy they would really be able to benefit from in the US, apart from extorting or forcing some of the Venezuelans into sexual exploitation. So yeah, it could happen. I know there's been a couple of arrests of Tren de Aragua members. I have not seen any evidence of an organized cell in America. And in Europe, I think even less. Niño Guerrero's brother was arrested in Spain a few months ago. I think there was a couple of arrests of Tren de Aragua members in London. I did not look at those case files, so I don't know how legitimate those arrests were, if they were really Tren de Aragua. I think those were probably... They might have been sent to do some deal, but I think there was more likely people who are running away. There is a problem now with Tren de Aragua, is that if you are a police commander looking to justify your budget or looking to tap into funds that have been unblocked, special task force against Tren de Aragua, arresting 2 Venezuelans who've been selling drugs and saying, "Oh my God, I arrested 2 Tren de Aragua members," is difficult to prove and it's difficult to disprove. So the chances that you'll be believed and that your higher echelons will also take credit for that arrest is high. And that has happened a lot. There are credible factions of Tren de Aragua in Chile, in Peru, in Brazil, in Colombia, but not every Venezuelan who's being arrested is Tren de Aragua. That requires more rigorous investigation, more rigorous fact-checking from judges and prosecutors, more rigorous understanding of what is Tren de Aragua. So I think that the doubts should not just be in the US and in Europe, but also in what's coming out of Chile and Peru.
So we suspect then that potentially they'll work with the cartels in Mexico, rather than to try and work parallel to them. They'll work with it. So I find it very interesting, because this is a transnational organized crime group. How many members are we looking at? What's the number?
So I always hesitate to estimate numbers of criminal groups, because again, there's different types of members. You've got the hardcore nucleus, the original crew in Tocorón, and the people that they sent or that they knew were being recruited in those countries. Then you have, let's say, a second level, which are smaller factions like Hijos de Dios or Los Gallegos, who are affiliated to Tren de Aragua, but the connections that they have, the amount of money that they pay up to Venezuela is not fully understood. Then under that, you have women being exploited, families being forced to carry drugs and often jailed for doing just that, and arrested as being Tren de Aragua members when they're utterly unwilling participants. Certainly, the number of people working for the gang, willingly or unwillingly, is in the thousands, probably in the tens of thousands. Across all countries. That doesn't mean that there are tens of thousands of hardcore Venezuelan gang members invading South America, as is sadly all too often the image of the group that is being given.
Yeah, this first Venezuelan international crime syndicate. So do you think then that they will be content to just manage within the continent itself, consolidate the routes through Peru, Chile, I would say likely further into Brazil? Uruguay, of course, is very much under threat. Argentina, I would say, is probably quite open as well, security-wise. Far other issues pressing there. So how do you feel that this might develop?
I think now this is a real test in institutional capacity. Because yes, Tren de Aragua developed a fantastic model in Tocorón, where they were making a lot of money from extorting prisoners and controlling all aspects of life in that prison and in the state of Aragua. Then they expanded to the Colombian-Venezuelan border, and then they thought, well, that worked very well, so we'll do it in Trinidad and Tobago, we'll do it in Peru, we'll do it in Chile. Where that goes next depends. Chile, so far, has been remarkably strong in not falling to the Bukele, for example, not falling to Maduro, even though the country is seeing a spike in homicides, spike in kidnappings, spike in extortion, spike in sex crimes. The institutional strength of Chile at the moment is holding. Peru is more worrying. Peru, with that rotating door of presidents and a lot of political unrest, that makes it easier for a gang to really sink its roots into the country. Brazil, again, the extent of Tren de Aragua being in Brazil is in Roraima, in the north, and selling guns. We know that they're selling weapons to Brazilian groups. An expansion further than that requires two things. One would require the diaspora to keep moving, which at the moment it isn't. It's pretty much the same routes that are being used, and now the route north. So when we look at Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, those are not countries where a massive number of Venezuelans are going, which would allow for them to expand the same way. Or they evolve into, they find yet another opportunity to adapt. What that would look like, I don't know. The big, let's say, gap in Tren de Aragua's criminal portfolio is their lack of involvement in international drug trafficking. Right? This is, they're not the FARC, they're not the Urabeños, they're not the Medellin cartel sending drugs north. At some point, you begin to think, okay, if you're Niño Guerrero, how can I next monetize the routes that I control? There's no indication that they're going in that direction, but obviously that's a glaring gap in their criminal resume. Yeah. I think one of the big areas now that they control is weapons trafficking. I think that is underestimated as a source of income for Tren de Aragua, because all the countries that we've listed, maybe except Chile, are vulnerable to weapons trafficking. Other gangs in the region need those weapons. They have connections in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Colombia to get weapons. So that could be one area. And I think the second thing is extortion. Extortion is becoming an incredibly important and underestimated tool for criminal gangs across South America. In my book about the Jalisco cartel, I talk about how the Jalisco cartel moves into an area and extorts every single peso they can from established industries. Everything. ranching, tequila, hotels, anything they can. Seeing Tren de Aragua move in that direction, I think, is quite likely. We know already that it has extensive extortion networks in Venezuela. In Bogota, increasingly seen as a major threat of extortion in Bogota, in Quito, in several cities in Chile. So settling in, nailing their place in those cities, expanding their extortion networks, I think is step one, and that's already happening. Step two, I would imagine gun trafficking is a potential earner for them. Step three, this is complete speculation. That international drug trafficking gap might look mighty attractive at some point, given the routes that they control.
Yeah, and that's step three. When you say about the international drug trafficking, you did mention Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, its proximity to Venezuela is obviously very attractive. I could see it. I mean, I could see definitely with the chaos in the Caribbean right now. Obviously, I'm pointing at Haiti. That could be a definite expansion. And you look at the other islands nearby, Curacao. I know they're small, Aruba, and these, lend themselves to definite sort of, let's say, criminal colonization.
The Venezuela to Caribbean criminal connections is one of the leading edges of criminal research in the area. I know Inside Crime is doing excellent work on this. Tren de Aragua has connections with Trinidad, as do lots of other little criminal groups in Venezuela. Cocaine is sent through the Caribbean route from Venezuela. Human trafficking is huge. Weapons trafficking happens. Piracy happens. The way that works is not fully mapped out. That is something that is being worked on, I know, by several organizations. So Tren de Aragua's expansion into the Caribbean seems obvious. The problem there is that you run into, on the Dutch side, some institutional strength in Curacao and Aruba. Obviously, those islands have been used for drug trafficking, but you do run into European and American surveillance networks that patrol the Caribbean, right? So it's not necessarily that easy. Trinidad, we know, is open to organized crime on many levels. The local gangs in Trinidad and Tobago and local gangs in Venezuela do collaborate. That network exists, and we know of Venezuelan presences in Aruba and Curacao, but it is limited in terms of migrants going there. In terms of there is some surveillance, there is some institutional strength there to block that expansion.
Okay. So, I mean, aside from, let's say, institutional strength in these countries, uncorrupted judicial system and so on, what can be done in Chile, in Peru, in the countries so affected by the Tren de Aragua?
The major gap right now in Tren de Aragua knowledge, and I know that there is an effort to work on that in the region, but of course, Venezuela is not playing ball, is follow the money. Right? Mexico is willing to play ball and follow the money when it comes to the cartels. Venezuela isn't. So it is difficult to understand where the money goes inside Venezuela because there's a major player that doesn't want to play. There was an example where one of the number 2 or number 3 in a guy called Larry Changa was in Chile. He went to Chile in 2018, I believe. And was set up several businesses there. Chilean authorities began to track him, identified who he was and were trying to follow him. Before they could catch him, he left the country. But they were tracking financial movements between him and Chile and going back to Venezuela. That's always the start, right? Rather than dropping bodies or doing a kingpin strategy and trying to kill the leaders, follow the money. Find out where the network is based from that. That really is actionable intelligence. The second thing, and I think there's a case right now happening in Chile, which is hugely important. It's the case of Los Gallegos. Los Gallegos is probably the largest faction of Tren de Aragua that was positively identified as being from them in Chile. I think well over a dozen members are currently on trial. It started in April in Chile. That trial is going to be hugely important, both to see the evidence that Chile has about how Tren de Aragua groups operate in the country, 2, about what evidence is revealed, and 3, about the sentencing. Because I think when we get to that, we'll understand how important, how influential those members were. What we haven't talked about is the other power base of Tren de Aragua, which is the Bolivar mining zone in Venezuela, right? There is credible evidence to say that Niño Guerrero has probably fled there, specifically to a region known as Las Claritas. There is a leader of Tren de Aragua, or at least a very close associate of them, called Johan Petrica, who some say is the actual leader of Tren de Aragua. There is always some discussion about whether it's Niño Guerrero or Johan Petrica. It's not necessarily very useful because it's complete speculation, but he operates a mining gang in the Bolivar mining area of Venezuela. This is a very remote, very lawless, very violent area of Venezuela. We know that the regime takes money or is at least paid off by the gangs who control this area. There have been clashes there between the army and certain gangs to try and take over some of these possessions. So it's very murky what the relations are between these mining syndicates, as they're called, and the regime. But Johan Petrica controls one of the most powerful syndicates in that area. It is a member or very close associated to Tren de Aragua. And that nucleus of gold mining provides them with another base of money. It is another center for drug trafficking, for illegal gold mining, for sexual exploitation, which has not been fully explored. So Tocorón has been taken out, but that Bolivar mining area remains a hugely important financial boost for the gang.
That is a very interesting topic that we don't hear about. We do hear about the ELN, so the National Liberation Army, the sort of, let's say, the last remaining official guerrilla group, leftist guerrilla group from Colombia, started in 1964 or thereabouts. We do hear about them providing like protection to mining interests in Venezuela. So you could imagine a full-on violent campaign between the two groups up there. The Tren de Aragua were interested in kicking out the ELN.
The relations between the ELN and the Tren de Aragua have been very complex. They have clashed and stopped repeatedly for the last 5-6 years. Right now, what the ELN presence is in Bolivar, I'm afraid I don't know. I haven't heard of any violence between the ELN and the Tren de Aragua. And again, the Tren de Aragua presence is very specific to that part of Venezuela. They certainly have interest in other parts of the country, but that control of gold mining is very much a Bolivar, Las Claritas. I mean, it's one of the richest gold mining areas in South America. The money coming out of there is in the millions. But so Tren de Aragua has been very good at having different nuclei of revenue, right? So you have Tocorón prison and the local town of San Vicente, which they controlled. You have this gold mining area in Bolivar. You have the Colombian-Venezuelan border in Las Trochas, and then you have operations in Peru. They are very good at decentralizing their operations, right? So if any one pillar falls, it doesn't threaten the entire edifice, even if it's on the scale of Tocorón.
Very interesting indeed. So, Chris, remind us when your book on the Tren de Aragua will come out and be available for our listeners.
October, in English and Spanish. And it'll be under the World of Crime banner.
So let me take this moment to say thank you very much to Chris Dalby. He is the director at World of Crime and, of course, the author of World of Crime Guides to Organized Crime. October, you heard it here. The book will be released. It'll be available for all of you, those interested. It's called Tren de Aragua, a quick guide to Venezuela's first cartel. Right now, the latest book released by Chris Dalby has been the Jalisco, what's it called? Jalisco Cartel New Generation. I have read it myself. It's a very, very comprehensive view of the cartel in Mexico. So, and again, if you are interested in this topic and these topics, can I please recommend you go over to World of Crime Guides to Organized Crime. And let me say, Chris Dalby, thank you so much for your time and sharing what seems like a bottomless pit of knowledge on this subject.
Thank you very much, Richard. You're much too kind.
Yes. This has been the Latin News Podcast, this week discussing the Tren de Aragua from Venezuela, Venezuela's first international crime syndicate. We've been talking to Chris Dalby, the director of World of Crime and World of Crime Guides to Organized Crime. I've been Richard McCall here in Bogota, Colombia. Thank you again, and we'll be back in another fortnight with more topical conversations about the region. So thank you again.